Think about the last time you booked a flight. You probably opened 3 or 4 tabs, compared prices, maybe waited a day or two to see if something cheaper would come up. Here's what you didn't know you were doing. You were slowly relying on one airline to keep everyone else honest. At 3 in the morning on May 2nd, that airline turned the lights off. 17,000 people lost their jobs before sunrise, and the invisible ceiling that had been holding your airfare down lifted. We're not talking about a minor inconvenience. A family of 4 that flew twice a year on Spirit. They just lost nearly $2,000 a year, and most of them don't know it yet. So let's talk about what actually happened, why it was inevitable, and, more importantly, what you can do about it before summer. Now, before we get into the details, I always like to be upfront with you. What I share on this channel is education. It's analysis. It is not financial advice, and it was never meant to be. Every person's situation is different, and if you're making significant decisions about your money, please talk to a professional who actually knows your numbers. All right. With that said, let's get into it. Spirit Airlines was founded in 1983. By the time it shut its doors, it had carried 44 million passengers in a single year and operated 192 aircraft across 65 airports. Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, Las Vegas, Detroit. Caribbean routes that middle-class families had built their vacations around for years. For a lot of Americans, Spirit wasn't glamorous. The seats were tight, the fees added up fast, and the boarding process was, well, let's call it character building. But here's the thing about Spirit that most people never fully appreciated. It wasn't just an airline, it was a pressure valve. When Spirit entered a route, competitors dropped their prices. When Spirit left a route, prices went back up. The Department of Justice actually had a name for this. They called it the Spirit Effect. 34 years, 44 million passengers a year. And then, 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning, it was over. Now, the headlines will tell you it was about fuel prices, or the bankruptcy filing, or the Iran situation. And those things are all true. But in my experience, when something this big collapses, there's never just one reason. So let's just start at the beginning, because to understand why Spirit died, you first have to understand why it was already on life support before a single drop of jet fuel changed price. Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. Working through the 2008 financial crisis, watching institutions that looked perfectly healthy on a Tuesday morning stop existing by Thursday afternoon. The collapse is never the cause. The collapse is just the moment the math catches up. Spirit's math had been catching up for years. Here's a number that tells the whole story. In 2024, before Iran, before the second bankruptcy, before any of it, 59% of Spirit's revenue wasn't coming from selling you a seat. It was coming from charging you for your bag, your seat selection, your carry-on, your water. Nearly 6 out of every $10 Spirit collected had nothing to do with flying you anywhere. Now, when that model was invented back in 2007, it was genuinely revolutionary. You strip the fare down to almost nothing, then you monetize everything else. Smart, for a while. But here's what happened between 2019 and 2024. American Airlines looked at Spirit's numbers and said, "We can do that." Delta said the same thing. United said the same thing. They rolled out basic economy products specifically engineered to match Spirit's headline fare on every overlapping route. And suddenly Spirit's one advantage, the price, wasn't an advantage anymore. By 2024, Spirit was losing 2 cents on every single available seat mile it flew. Not because of fuel, not because of Iran, because the business model had already been hollowed out. That was problem number 1. Then came problem number 2, and this one came from inside the planes themselves. Spirit operated 91 A320neo aircraft. Modern planes, fuel-efficient, the backbone of their future. In July 2023, Pratt & Whitney, the engine manufacturer, disclosed a manufacturing defect, a powder metal contamination issue that required immediate inspection across their entire GTF engine line. For most airlines, this was a headache. For Spirit, it was a crisis. At the peak, early 2025, 39 of Spirit's 91 neo aircraft were sitting on the ground, not flying, not generating revenue, just sitting. 43% of their most modern fleet parked. Now, Pratt & Whitney did pay compensation, roughly $300 million over 2 years. But here's what money can't buy you: the hours those planes should have been in the air. Aircraft utilization dropped from 11.1 hours per day in 2023 to 9.9 hours in 2024. That doesn't sound like much. But for an ultra-low-cost carrier, built entirely on squeezing maximum revenue out of every single aircraft every single day, that gap is the difference between surviving and not. So, broken business model, 2 bankruptcies in 9 months, and then February 2026. The third blow landed when U.S. and Israeli forces struck Iran in late February. Jet fuel was trading at $2.24 a gallon. Spirit had built their entire restructuring plan around that number. By late April, $4.51, nearly double, in 60 days. Spirit's attorneys told the bankruptcy court that fuel costs alone added roughly $100 million in March and April. $100 million in 2 months for an airline that was already losing money before the first dollar increase hit. The Trump administration put together a $500 million rescue package. It would have given the federal government a 90% equity stake in the airline. The bondholders voted it down on May 1st. Hours later, the flights were canceled. One creditor, speaking to Reuters, said it better than I ever could: "You can't breathe life into a corpse." Now, here's where most analysts stop the story. They say, Spirit collapsed, that's unfortunate, moving on. But you and I, we're not moving on. Because the real question, the question that matters to your household budget, is what happens to airfares now that the one airline keeping everyone honest is gone. Let me put a number on this, because I think numbers are more honest than headlines. The Department of Justice, during the JetBlue merger trial a couple of years back, presented research on what they called the Spirit effect. Here's what it showed. When Spirit entered a route, average fares dropped 21%. When Spirit left a route, average fares rose 23%, roughly $60 per round trip. Spirit just exited every route it ever flew, simultaneously, overnight. Now let's make that real. A family of 4. 2 trips a year, say Fort Lauderdale to somewhere warm in February, and maybe a summer run out to Las Vegas. On Spirit, all in, you're looking at roughly $117 per segment. Round that up across 4 people, 2 round trips, about $1,900 a year. The national average domestic round trip right now? About $478. Same family, same 2 trips, nearly $4,000. That's not a rounding error. That is almost $2,000 a year, gone. And that's before the post-shutdown fare increases have fully worked their way through the system. Because here's what Hopper's data is already showing for summer 2026. Fuel costs alone are running about 10% above pre-war forecasts. Layer the Spirit exit on top of that, another 15 to 25% on the routes Spirit used to serve. And international, Kayak measured U.S. International round trips averaging over $1,000 by late April, up 42% from late February. Now, I want to show you that this pain is not evenly distributed, because where you live matters enormously here. Fort Lauderdale, Spirit held 31% of that airport's passenger market share, 6 straight years as the #1 carrier. 11 million passengers, 60 routes, gone overnight. DePaul University's transportation researchers called it, and I'm quoting directly here, a devastating blow. But Fort Lauderdale will recover. It's a major hub. JetBlue has already announced 11 new routes there. Frontier moved in fast. The pain will be real, but it won't be permanent. The harder story is somewhere else entirely. Think about Atlantic City, Niagara Falls, Myrtle Beach, Plattsburgh, New York, Pensacola. These are communities where Spirit wasn't competing with 3 other carriers. Spirit was the carrier, the only ultra-low-cost option within a reasonable drive. For a family in one of those cities, the math isn't a 23% increase. It's a 90-minute drive to the nearest major hub, plus a legacy airline fare that was never designed for their budget. We're talking 50, sometimes 100% effective price increase, not on paper, in practice. And then there are the routes that people don't talk about enough. The Caribbean, Latin America, Aruba, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Cancun, Costa Rica, Cartagena, Lima, Bogota. Spirit was flying these routes at prices that, frankly, had no business being that low. That floor is gone now, and nothing is coming to replace it anytime soon. So when someone asks me, is this really that big a deal? I tell them, it depends entirely on your zip code and your passport. Now, I can already hear the question forming. What about Frontier? What about the other budget carriers? Surely someone steps in and fills the gap. It's a fair question, and the answer is a lot more complicated than you'd hope. All right, let's talk about who's left. Because the instinct, the reasonable optimistic instinct, is to say, market abhors a vacuum. Spirit leaves, someone else moves in, prices stabilize. I understand that instinct. I just don't think the data supports it. Before Spirit's closure, the ultra-low-cost carrier field in the United States had 5 players: Spirit, Frontier, Sun Country, Breeze, and Avelo. Within roughly 12 months, that number effectively drops to 3 independent operators, and not 3 healthy ones. Let's start with Frontier, because they're the name everyone mentions first, and fairly so. 32% route overlap with Spirit. They moved fast. 9 new former Spirit routes added within days. 15 additional daily departures across their key hubs. Record revenue in Q1 2026. They will benefit from Spirit's exit. That part is true. But here's what Frontier also announced in 2026. A first-class cabin. Now, I say that with no judgment. It's a rational business decision. But let's be clear about what it means. The airline that was supposed to be Spirit's natural replacement is actively moving away from the model that made Spirit affordable in the first place. They're not filling Spirit's shoes. They're buying different shoes entirely. Sun Country, consistently profitable, genuinely well-run. 14 straight profitable quarters. But Sun Country is being acquired by Allegiant. And Allegiant itself just lost $520 million on a failed resort project. That's not a cavalry coming over the hill. That's 2 companies trying to figure out their own situation. Breeze Airways, David Neeleman's latest venture, posted its first net profit in mid-2025. Good sign. But Breeze is private, cash-dependent, and built around niche point-to-point routes. It is not a national price enforcer. It never was. And Avelo, well, Avelo exited 18 of 74 markets in a single year. One aviation analyst called it one more throw of the dice. That is not the profile of a carrier that stabilizes national airfares. And then there's JetBlue, which, I want to be precise here, is not an ultra-low-cost carrier. Never was. JetBlue is running a negative 3.7% operating margin, over $5 billion in debt. They announced 11 new Fort Lauderdale routes, which is genuinely helpful for Fort Lauderdale. But JetBlue is not in a position to be anyone's budget option right now. So here's the honest summary. 5 players became 3. The 3 that remain are either drifting toward the legacy model, mid-acquisition, or too small to matter at scale. And the major carriers, American, Delta, United, Southwest, they introduced basic economy specifically because Spirit forced them to. With Spirit gone, that pressure is gone too. Barclays put it plainly in their analyst note. Industry pricing could benefit significantly for nearly all airlines given the removal of excess point-to-point capacity. Read that sentence carefully. Benefit for the airlines. Now, I've watched this industry for a long time. And when I say I've seen this before, I mean that very literally. Because every time a major, low-cost carrier has disappeared from the American market, the same thing has happened. And the data on what comes next is not comforting. I want to take you back to March 2008, not because it's ancient history, but because it's a preview. Aloha Airlines, 38 years of flying Hawaii's interisland routes. Gone in a single day, March 31, 2008, after a predatory pricing war it simply couldn't survive. The CEO, David Banmiller, watched it happen in real time. He later said that Hawaiian interisland fares went from an average of $60 to $93. Overnight. A 55% jump. For families living on those islands, people who weren't flying for vacation, they were flying to see their doctors, visit their parents, get to work. That wasn't an inconvenience. That was a household budget crisis. I remember sitting in a meeting around that time. We were tracking regional airline failures as economic indicators. And someone across the table said, "When the cheap seats disappear, it's always the people who needed them most who feel it first." I've never forgotten that. Independence Air, January 2006, Dulles Airport. The moment they shut down, U.S. Airways rescinded the 40% promotional cuts they'd launched specifically to compete with independents. Same day. The discounts existed because of the competition. The competition ended. So did the discounts. ATA Airlines, April 2008. Southwest bought the assets. Slots only. No aircraft. No employees. For $7.5 million. Pan Am dismembered in 1991 after the Gulf War fuel spike. Eastern Airlines the same year. TWA absorbed into American in 2001, and the St. Louis hub that TWA built over decades was essentially a ghost town by 2009. Every single time. The same arc. A carrier disappears, competitors pull back their discounts, fares rise, and here's the part that matters. They don't come back down. The GO documented 5.7 to 9.7% fare increases on overlapping routes after the United Continental merger alone. Academic research puts the average post-merger price increase at 6.4%. And these aren't temporary adjustments. The pricing power, once gained, stays gained. In 1978, the year airline deregulation passed, there were 11 major trunk carriers in the United States. By 1991, roughly 10. By 2008, 7. Today, in 2026, 4 carriers control approximately 80% of domestic capacity. Every fuel shock, every recession, every geopolitical event, the industry comes out the other side more concentrated than it went in. Now, I've told you this story before. Different names, different dates, same ending. But I want to be honest with you about something. Because this time, there is one thing that is genuinely different. And it's the thing that makes spirits collapse, unlike any airline failure I've seen in 30 years of watching this industry. This is the first time. The airline that died was the last thing keeping prices honest. Let me bring this home. Pan Am was a premium carrier. Eastern was a legacy airline. Aloha was regional. ATA was marginal. Every airline that disappeared before Spirit, they were not the reason your ticket was affordable. Spirit was. Spirit was the reason American introduced basic economy. Spirit was the reason Delta matched fares on routes it would never have touched otherwise. Spirit was, whether they intended to be or not, the price enforcer for the entire industry. With Spirit gone and Sun Country absorbed into Allegiant, and Frontier quietly adding first-class cabins, the United States enters SUMFEMU 26 with the least competitive ultra-low-cost landscape it has had in 20 years. And based on every data point we have, from GIA studies to MIT research to Cirium fare analysis, that is not a temporary condition. Now, I don't say any of this to make you feel helpless, because there are things you can actually do right now. Practical things. Let me give you 3. First, if you were booked on Spirit, or if you're rebooking travel for this summer, the next 2 weeks are the cheapest rebooking window you're going to see. After that, summer inventory tightens and prices climb further. Move now. Second, if you have free Spirit miles, vouchers, or travel credits, I'm sorry to tell you this, but they are almost certainly worthless. They're tied up in bankruptcy court, and the odds of recovery for most consumers are very low. If you paid with a credit card, you're in better shape. Credit card purchases get automatic refunds. Call your card issuer if you haven't already. Third, and this is the longer game, start thinking about your travel budget differently. The era of the $49 Fort Lauderdale fare is over. Not forever, necessarily. But for the foreseeable future, air travel for middle-class American families is going to cost more. Slowly. Build that into your planning. Don't be caught off guard when the number shows up on your screen. In 30 years of watching this industry, through deregulation, through 9/11, through 2008, through COVID, I have never seen a moment quite like this one. Because every other time a major carrier disappeared, the market lost a competitor. This time, the market lost a referee. Cheap flying in America has died before, but this is the first time it died, slowly, because the cheap airline itself was the last thing keeping prices honest. If this breakdown helped you make sense of what's happening and what it's going to cost you this summer, subscribing means you won't miss what's coming next. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, because Spirit's story doesn't exist in a vacuum, Higher airfares, higher grocery bills, higher mortgage payments, these things are all connected. And the institution sitting at the center of all of it is the Federal Reserve. We recently broke down what's happening inside the Fed right now. Powell, Warsh, the leadership question, and what it all means for your mortgage rate. If you haven't seen that one yet, it's the logical next step from everything we just talked about. I'll put it right here. I'm also curious. Where was the last place you flew on Spirit? And have you checked what that same route costs today? Leave it in the comments. I have a feeling the numbers are going to surprise people. I'll see you in the next one.